Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Steve Leibowitz. Just last week on Insider, we spoke about the lack of an Israeli post-war plan for Gaza. Now we hear reports that for lack of Israeli initiative, Washington has come up with a plan of its own. According to Politico, the Biden administration is considering appointing a U.S. official as top advisor to a mostly Palestinian force charged with securing a post-war Gaza. The civilian advisor would be based in the region but not in Gaza and work with the commanding officer of the force, who would either be Palestinian or from an Arab nation. The planning envisions the U.S. will be at the center of what will be a long time in Gaza after the war ends. The advisor would never set foot in Gaza and possibly base in Jordan the peacekeeping force charged with stabilizing post-war Gaza, namely to maintain security and replace Hamas governance or return to power. The officials added that a ceasefire and the return of hostages must come first. The Biden administration is trying to convince Arab states such as Egypt, Morocco, and the United Arab Emirates to join the peacekeeping force, and reported broad agreement between the U.S. and regional players to help form a Palestinian council comprising Palestinians from Gaza to serve as an interim governing structure. I know that was a lot to take in. Well, joining us to discuss the U.S. plan and other U.S.-Israel-related issues are political science professor and head of NGO Monitor, Dr. Gerald Steinberg, and Foreign Ministry Special Envoy, Flor Hassan Nahum. Thank you both for joining us. Gerald, I'd like to start with you. Is it likely that once Hamas is defeated, if we reach that day, can the U.S. and friends create a peacekeeping force to keep Hamas from returning to power and bring an alternative government to Gaza?
This is not going to be a 2-hour seminar, so I'm going to just hit a few high points on this plan, which strikes me, I think the Hebrew word is hazui. I don't know how to translate it into English, except it's totally
weird,
unrealistic.
Bizarre.
Okay.
Bizarre.
I'll stick with unrealistic.
Okay.
As an academic, I'll use unrealistic as a starting point. Very, very messianic, I think. The key points, first of all, are after there's a ceasefire, after Hamas is defeated, after the hostages are released. Well, we're not there yet. We're not even close to there yet. We continue to see Hamas regrouping. We continue to see the rocket attacks. We see the IDF still having to work very hard to destroy the tunnels, and we're a long way to go from that. So I think what this is a trial balloon is the term that's often used. And one of the reasons is because the Israeli government has failed to really grapple with the issue, at least publicly, of the day after. And we know there are a lot of internal fights that the other two members of the inner cabinet, Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, have told Netanyahu, especially Gantz, that the Israeli government, that Netanyahu has to June 8th to come up with a post-war plan. And I think the American leak is designed to help Gantz and help press Israel to come up with an alternative. A multinational Arab country, Palestinian Authority with an American official at the top who doesn't set foot into Gaza, none of that has any chance of working. We know that historically. We just have to look north at Lebanon, which many outside commentators tend to forget about, an ongoing war with Hezbollah.
We'll get to Lebanon.
And the failure of the international community to do, but it's the point of the failure of the international community to do what it takes upon itself to do to protect Israeli security, which is very blatant in the case of Lebanon.
And we're going to be talking more about Lebanon. Flor, what does it say about American involvement when the plan includes no U.S. boots on the ground, and even the so-called U.S. advisor would be elsewhere?
Well, I want to look, first of all, this would never have happened if we would have had some clear strategy from the Israeli government about the day after. You can't expect there ever to be a vacuum of power. That doesn't exist. The minute something's not there, something else will fill its place. And this is exactly what's happening. If we knew what was going to happen the day after, then we wouldn't have the Americans trying to figure out and engineer what they can have as a plausible plan for the day after. Now, I've been saying since the beginning that post-war Gaza, in terms of its civil administration, should actually include Abraham Accords countries with the US. I always thought that was a good idea. Why do I think that? Well, first of all, I think that when you look at de-radicalization in the region, you look at the UAE and you look at Saudi, and the UAE possibly the best example of a moderate Sunni Arab country that has worked very hard and very successfully to de-radicalize their population. They've been successful. So the way I see it, why don't we take the people, if they want to be involved, who have already driven out the Muslim Brotherhood from their communities, and let them help us drive the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, out of Gaza. And what that does is that it doesn't get the Jewish state in the eye of the storm or under the microscope of everything we do in Gaza. And quite frankly, I don't think we have the bandwidth to run the entire lives of the people in Gaza.
The civil administration,
from
sure.
Israel. I wouldn't want us to run the civil administration in Gaza. Absolutely, that the security has to remain in our hands. But if we can do that with partners from the US and from the moderate Sunni Arab countries, I would welcome it.
All right.
Now,
so Flora,
if they're going to appoint a governor, I would have to see who this person is. Because if they're going to appoint somebody like the guy who's supposed to be in charge of the Palestinian territories in the White House, thankfully, I would say no thanks. We would have to see which type of administrator, which type of governor, let's call it, they would appoint.
Gerald, and we said we'd come back to the north. Well, are there examples around the world of this type of peacekeeping force being effective? I guess I'm thinking of UNIFIL, where it's not very effective. Or will this be kind of a trial and error effort? What could possibly go wrong?
Well, again, we're coming back to not just Lebanon, but I can't think offhand of any significant success. The one exception, and I use the word significant, it's quite different, is the multilateral force in Sinai. That the original part of that was after the Kissinger negotiated disengagement agreements after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and there were 2 disengagement agreements. There was also there's a buffer zone with observers in between Israel and Syria, which kind of still functions, except when the observers run away. But we have many, many examples of failure. There's another one I want to put on the table here. That's why I think this whole thing is not at all serious or realistic. When Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza in 2005, the European Union said, "Oh, we'll post some sort of an international force, a European force." It was called Eurobam, European Border Monitoring something or other, at Rafah. That's in the news now, right? It's southern Gaza, between Israel and Egypt, and we'll monitor people going in and out, tunnels underneath. As soon as Hamas showed up a few months later with guns, all those European observers, the force that was there, ran away, and they were in Herzliya. They may still be there at a hotel at European taxpayer expense 10, 15 years later after that. This is just not a practical program because nobody's going to risk their lives for Israeli security. It has to be, as Flair said, Israel has to be responsible for security, and to the degree that the Abraham Accord countries, UAE, Bahrain, other countries, maybe the Saudi Arabia, maybe other countries can be involved in that process in the civil administration, that would be very, very useful. But I think Israel cannot bet its security on some sort of multinational force, which never works.
Fleur, if indeed Egypt is serious about helping, don't they have a lot to gain from a pacified Gaza without Hamas allied with the Muslim Brotherhood on their borders? They ran Gaza until 1967. Maybe they'd be ready to return and be part of this multinational force as well.
Well, that doesn't seem to be what's happened so far. Egypt, instead of being part of the solution, they have a border with Gaza. They've been very much part of the problem. We find out that there's 50 tunnels going from Egypt to Gaza. I'm not saying that it's government policy, but somebody was turning a blind eye whilst all these soldiers in the border were getting rich from being bribed by Hamas. And where was the government when it was not a well-kept secret? Egypt is the country that borders Gaza, and yet they've shown absolutely no desire to help during the war with refugees the way that countries around Ukraine have done. And so I don't understand. Egypt is kind of trying to play a role here as a states country, a country with prestige in the Arab world, but all they've really managed to do is wash their hands from this conflict as if they didn't have a border with Gaza, as if it wasn't part of their problem, and as if it wasn't their people. And so I hope that they turn this around. I think that America has incredible leverage over Egypt. Egypt is a country on the verge of economic collapse. The UAE are investing in Egypt. They're going to create an island off the coast of Egypt, and the US literally is maintaining Egypt's economy. So if there's any time to demand something of Egypt, because they really should take some of the responsibility for this mess, it is now.
Well, changing direction slightly, I happened to be in Washington in 2015 at an AIPAC conference, and Prime Minister Netanyahu came to address Congress against the will of then-President Obama. Not exactly a high point in U.S. relations. Let's hear from Republican Speaker Mike Johnson, who just this week decided to invite Netanyahu back to Congress to show bipartisan support.
And tonight, I'm happy to announce something else to you, that we will soon be hosting Prime Minister Netanyahu at the Capitol for a joint session of Congress. Yes. This will be a timely and I think a very strong show of support to the Israeli government in their time of greatest need. But thank you so much.
Gerald, what do you think this will do for relations between Netanyahu and President Biden? Not exactly a bipartisan move, is it?
Let's first wait and see if this actually happens. Very nice to have the invitation. I'm sure that in terms of Netanyahu and his supporters, people around him, his advisors, this is a nice boost. But going to Washington and actually speaking, if it is seen not as a bipartisan support for Israel, but as a Republican House of Representatives based political statement, it's friction with the Biden administration, which frankly we don't need now. We need the United States support. We've seen it repeatedly. Israel is dependent on American military support. We saw that both on the night of, April 14th, 15th, with the Iranian attack, and we've seen it also with the dependence on various kinds of munitions that Israel needs, all sorts of aspects like that. So Israel needs to go to a bipartisan position and not be caught in the American Republican versus Democratic election year campaign friction, more than friction, the very difficult relations that are taking place there. So my advice would be to not take the invitation up at this time. It's also important to realize that although Netanyahu is the prime minister, by law, by practice, he is also in a war cabinet with Mr. Gantz and with Mr. Eisenkot, and it needs as much unity as possible needs to be shown. If this is seen as Netanyahu going on his own and creating more friction with the American government, I think that would also make governance in Israel more difficult. That's something we don't need.
Fleur, do you get the sense that as far as Johnson and perhaps Netanyahu are concerned, the U.S. is already in election mode, and he may believe that he can afford to burn ties with the Democrats and plan for another Trump administration?
Well, I think it's a risk to take. I agree with every single word that Professor Steinberg just said. You can't go out there and poke somebody in the eye to make a point. We cannot get involved in other people's election. Israel has to always remain a bipartisan issue. A lot of that has been frayed. And to be honest, I think a lot of the friction we have today is still the friction that was created by when Netanyahu did that all those years ago. I'm not saying that there is no imperative to warn the United States about the dangers of Iran. What I'm saying is that sometimes there's more diplomatic ways to do things.
Gerald, Spain, Ireland, and Norway are planning to recognize a Palestinian state next week. What harm does it do to Israel, and do you expect it to become a growing trend?
Spain, I think just a few hours ago, said that they are announcing, the Prime Minister of Spain announced that they are recognizing, he may have tried to get a little bit of a head start over the Irish and the Norwegians, not that makes a whole lot of difference. In practical terms, there is no Palestinian state. They're not recognizing anything. In political terms, it is a statement. It's more support for the Palestinian cause, for the Palestinians as victims, for erasing the actual events, that the horror, the atrocity of October 7th. It's not Hamas, it's not the attack, it's not the terrible slaughter of Israelis, it's not the hostages. The leaders of those three countries are saying, no, it's Palestinians have the right to a state. And if there's a state, there can be a two-state solution. And if there's a two-state solution, everybody will be happy, live happily ever after. That is, I call it messianic. It's not just idealistic, it's messianic. It has no substance. I've had a one-way correspondence. I know the foreign minister of Norway. We've had many conversations, international conferences, also in Oslo. I wrote a piece because he didn't answer my private letter in the Jerusalem Post, saying this contradicts what you had told me, what Norway in your political framework has stood for. This is a return to Oslo, only worse. Oslo was at least done with the cooperation of the Israeli government at the time under Shimon Peres, Yossi Beilin. These kinds of acts, they're political. It's political theater. It's an act that puts these small three countries, which have no real understanding of the complexities and no interest of the complexities of the Israel and Palestinian framework. They want to have some sort of headlines. It's also domestic politics for their own constituencies. And Israel needs to say, you can do whatever you want, but it's not going to have any impact on our policies. It has no real meaning. It actually rewards terrorism. It rewards Palestinians for return for their intransigence, for refusing to negotiate for so many years. We're just going to give you a state. It doesn't really mean anything. It actually makes peacemaking and statesmanship in the Middle East even more difficult.
So if I understand what's being said, Fleur, international recognition of a Palestinian state doesn't actually make it so. What's the actual impact on the ground?
Well, I've been very involved, of course, as you know, with the Spanish announcement. I speak Spanish. I think I'm one of the only few politicians in this country who speaks mother tongue Spanish. So I've been busy attacking the Spanish government in the press for the last week, especially the vice president, who I think gives us a little insight into what they really feel when she comes out and says, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, completely, of course, ignoring the context of the conflict, the history of the conflict. And as I declared on Spanish TV, she's either ignorant or an anti-Semite. Does she want to continue the Inquisition? So that's how I feel about it. Again, they particularly said this morning, East Jerusalem as the capital. Where exactly is that line? Is it in the middle of the old city? Is there any significance to what they're doing? And I think that Professor Steinberg is correct. These are three irrelevant European countries looking for headlines, looking for relevance, looking for influence, and this is not going to help them do any of that.
All right, we're getting close to the end of the time, but I have to ask both of you this. Professor Steinberg, let me start with you. The incident in Rafah this week, the killing of 40 Palestinians who were sheltering, Israel targeted a legitimate target, killed two prominent Hamas terrorists, but the civilian deaths occurred nonetheless. Is this the type of an event that will effectively or could effectively bring an end to the war? And I ask that after I just heard on my way to the studio today that Israeli tanks have rumbled into the center of Rafah. So I guess it's really not preventing the operation from going forward.
It was certainly tragic, the events. The images are very, very difficult to look at, but it was an accident. It was because of Hamas putting top terror leaders among civilians. Unlike many of the claims, accusations that are made by propagandists all over the world, this was outside of the humanitarian zone, not inside. And it was because of either fuel or ammunition that Hamas had stored there that blew up, not because of directly because of the Israeli munitions. But that doesn't change the images. The images are horrible. The responses are based on emotions, understandable human emotions, not based on political calculations. I think it will put more pressure on Israel to bring this conflict to an end quickly. And by having the forces in Rafah doing as much damage to the tunnel infrastructure as possible in the next week or two, that may have to be a point where Israel will agree also to release, if the hostages are released, will agree to a ceasefire if the hostages are released and if Israel can do enough damage to the Hamas infrastructure. These kinds of events are part of war. They're tragic. And none of the critics have come up with any better way to fight this war, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to have an impact. It does have an impact.
Well, Fleur, just yesterday, the Prime Minister from the Knesset spoke about victory until the flag of victory is raised. The tanks are operating in the center of Rafah now, and yet the professor says that we could be only a couple of weeks away from a pause, an extended pause, a ceasefire, possibly the end of the war, and an exchange of hostages in a couple of weeks. Do you see it going that direction?
I believe that we should all be looking at the issue with the hostages as if our own children were in there. I cannot stand this anymore when people are equating losing this war with getting the hostages home. We cannot win this war without getting those hostages home. And so I say, let's do anything we can, anything at all. Play it smart, which we haven't done, because we gave them a temporary ceasefire just before Ramadan without getting one hostage home. And so the way I see it is, there was a ceasefire on October 6th. We need to do anything we can to get our hostages home, and we don't have to play by any rules once they're home.
Final word, Gerald?
Diplomatically, politically, socially, Israel's very isolated in the world, and that's not an easy position to be in. Even the United States, the pressure that's on, we get the public opinion polls show a lot of support for Israel, very broad, but still, these types of images, these type of events, as we saw yesterday, do erode that gradually. And we have to, our leadership has to be more aware of the bigger picture. It connects also with the invitation, whether Netanyahu should take it or not, to speak in Congress to just Republicans and be part of that whole American political
Gerald,
fight.
we're going to have to pick it up.
Being smart is the key point, and I agree with Flair.
All right, we're going to have to pick it up another time. Thank you both so much for joining us. It's all the time we have this evening. Thank you to our guests, Dr. Gerald Steinberg and Special Foreign Ministry Envoy Fleur Hassan-Nachum. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at ILTV.tv. Thanks for watching. Let's win the war and bring them home.